Hello, BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin, our slow march through my penguin wall. We've been going author by author and era by era, work by work. And recently I fell into a habit that a lot of old friends of mine could have seen coming a mile away, which is to just concentrate on ancient Rome. That has been the shorthand for Steve for such old friends of mine for a very long time. Dogs, dead Kennedys, and dead Romans, with the possible other exception of the House of Windsor. Uh, so I thought it was best if maybe this week we concentrate on a few Greeks and even up the scales a little. And the minute I thought that, I realized that there were a few major Greeks that we haven't talked about yet. And one of the most major of them all is Thucydides. This is the Peloponnesian War. This is Rex Warner's translation for Penguin Classics of Thucydides' great work, a founding work of what we consider to be history, the genre of history, with an excellent introduction by the classicist M.I. Finley. Rex Warner is also a great classicist, and the two of them together are great in the same way, which is that they always remembered uh, to make this stuff plain. They weren't just great classicists talking to other classicists, they were great teachers. So this is a wonderful volume, and as far as I know, it's still Penguin's volume of Thucydides. Uh, who had an interesting inspiration. He the major historical event of his own life, from his youth to his death, was the what we now call the Peloponnesian War, a great epic series of decades of battles between Sparta and Athens that lasted a long time. I mean, there was a long peace in between, but the peace was largely honored in the breach. And Thucydides wasn't just a witness to it, he was also a participant in it militarily, and had the idea that this event happening in his own lifetime was every bit as epic and noteworthy as any of the stuff that he had read about in the epics of Homer or the Greek tragedians or anything like that. And he decided to go at the subject in a different way. He didn't just accept oral history and the proto legend. How could he really, when a lot of the events hadn't happened yet and were happening right at the moment? And write them as close to how they happened as he could work. It might seem like nothing to us now, but it was revolutionary, as far as we know, without antecedent in the world of history writing. The closest that I think you can come is some of the proto-science writing that was happening in ancient Greek science writers in Athens and thereabouts at the time, where people were saying, well, yes, there's this old myth that's been handed down from Hesiod or whoever that for instance, I don't even know, that snakes can be born out of mud. Okay, well, I know the myth, and never mind the historic sagacity of the person who conveys the myth. Is it actually true? Is it actually factually true? And I'm going to inquire into that. That's the very word that Thucydides uses for what he's writing, an inquiry. I'm going to weigh it and investigate it rather than just pass it on. That mind frame of trying to figure out what happened, trying to convey what happened, is present all throughout Thucydides, who is not a particularly fun companion as a narrator, and who doesn't always stick to that. You might think, if that was his ethos, that of course this would be a work of ancient history that does not have, for instance, set speeches. We've talked before, and when we talked about Livy, and I think a little when we talked about Tacitus, that the standard of the ancient world was to put set speeches in the mouths of your historical characters without having any documentary evidence that they ever said anything like what you're saying, in order to dramatize and heighten the questions involved, the military questions involved, the philosophical questions involved. If you have a victorious general and an embassy from a beaten city, you would give them each a speech. Maybe one about the cost you pay if you rebel against authority, maybe the other about the qualities of mercy. And they would be there for rhetorical effect, twofold. First, to show your readers how good a job you could do at that. It might seem like nothing to us. It might seem, well, okay, well, that might be interesting, but you don't do that in a work of history. You do that in your memoirs, or if you write historical fiction, but you don't mix that in. But that wasn't the attitude or the practice at the time. And for instance, Livy does that all the time and is fantastic at it. That would be one reason. And the other reason would be to heighten the ideology involved in what you're doing, to purely for storytelling effect, to make sure that your readers knew the things that were at stake and how they would have been viewed. Thucydides mentions that he has a problem with that he has a problem with speeches, with the speeches. the speeches is a subject that comes up whenever you read ancient history. And it was true for the ancient historians. He makes a couple of excuses in the course of the Peloponnesian War, saying, if I have trouble remembering exactly what speech I myself heard Pericles give or whatever, then I'll do the best I can. I'll approximate the best I can. The same thing true with the ear witnesses and the eyewitnesses that I am interviewing in order to construct my history. If they don't remember precisely, well, then I'll help matters along. Which shows an awareness on his part that this was not in accord with the theory, the idea that he had come up with for how to write this. And naturally, peering over his shoulder the whole time was not just those prototypical Greek science writers who were looking at what actually constitutes fact. Also peering over his shoulder was Herodotus, the so-called father of history we'll be getting to this week, who wrote a great big book that is largely the prequel to this one. At least Thucydides seems to think of it as largely the prequel to the general subject matter that he's dealing with. And Herodotus is a very, very different writer, but he too is interrogating historical traditions rather than simply passing them along with flowery language. And that was a big change. That was a big deal, as it were. And it comes through in the Peloponnesian War. Rex Warner wrote popular works. He wrote works of popular history, works of popular biography. His book, Young Caesar, is worth reading today, although I don't think Rex Warner will ever be in print again. I don't think anything that he does, aside from maybe this, will ever be in print again. Thucydides can be a rough author to translate. He can be tough to translate. He's his defenders will say that his use of syntax and call and response is all carefully modulated to reflect the rough nature of his subject. I think he's just inept, largely inept. I don't see and have never seen any great artistry in this writer. I know that has outraged graduate students that I've known over the course of my life who have spent literally their whole professional career on this author, but I just don't see it, and I'm looking for it. So you have to make choices, and Thucydides has been a hobby horse of translators for hundreds and hundreds of years. In the mid-15th century, the great Lorenzo Valla translated the Peloponnesian War in its entirety from Greek into Latin. It just was the thing you did. And I think one of the earliest, maybe the earliest translation to any modern language was done into French from Valla's Latin rather than from the Greek. But the highlight of translating, no slight to Rex Warner, I'm sure that he would agree, is the great writer Thomas Hobbes, whose one of his first published books, might have been his first published books, was a translation of Thucydides that is brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. Yes, it's centuries old now, but it doesn't matter. It's just Rex Warner very delicately in his translator's note here mentions that Hobbes is great, but he has inaccuracies. He is frequently inaccurate. And I don't think that Rex Warner would quibble much if a modern critic were to look back from, this was done in the 1950s, and say, well, your translation is also has inaccuracies, and it doesn't have anything like the strength of Hobbes. So maybe sit down in the front row. And a sign of that is that Hobbes' translation was the one that was used for the landmark Thucydides, which is a great volume. It was the inaugural book in the landmark series. We've seen it for Julius Caesar, was the landmark Thucydides, and I was amazed at how much it opens up the work to have all of those introductory essays and especially all of those maps. Because Thucydides was trying to convey the epic nature of this war in his book. And I think he largely does that. It's just, I'm a little spoiled. I like historians, whether they be ancient or modern, to be good company. And Thucydides is definitely not that. You will not go to this book for that. This is still, I think, a book to have. The Penguin Classic. Mine is old, has been all over the world, and it's I don't know exactly when it's printed, but it's very much ration paper. The paper is as light as a feather. It's got that nice solid penguin binding. It's never going to fall apart. I reinforced it so that it would be, so that if people were spilling tea on it or whatever, it wouldn't just eat right through or warp. But that is our daily penguin for today. Is one of the fathers of history. Thucydides' Peloponnesian War makes for interesting reading. This is a good version to have because Rex Warner is very careful in ways and with emphases that Hobbes was not. But I would also suggest, much as I did with Julius Caesar, that you try to find a copy of the landmark Thucydides, or if you're interested in this author and you don't necessarily feel like having 5 copies of him in your house, your library, if you live in America or anywhere in Europe, in English-speaking countries, if you live anywhere in an English-speaking country, your library, any school, for instance, any university, will almost certainly have a copy of the landmark Thucydides. It's just too good for them not to. So I would suggest that you do that as well, especially since the few paltry maps in the Penguin Classic are never sufficient. You're going to want to know. When you read Thucydides, you're going to want to know what's happening and where it is in relation to what else. But you're mainly going to be struck by the human drama in here, as well you should. Almost against Thucydides' wishes. It's almost involuntary on his part. You can't help the human drama coming through. And that'll be the memorable parts here. Traditionally speaking, that'll be the memorable parts. I've known, again, some poor, wretched graduate students who ignored the human parts. They weren't even interested in them and just concentrated on where a certain ship was in a certain inlet. It's a little bit joyless. But we will move on from Thucydides tomorrow. We will do that shadow over his shoulder, and I will have a much more human elements to convey. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.